Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome back. For those of you, I know that some of you who joined only now, so you've missed the first half, but don't worry, we've got two exciting sessions coming up now, starting with this one. Just for clarification for everyone, this event is being done in partnership between University of Westminster, that's us, and Institute of Tibetan Affairs, that's Mr. Sonam Frasila there. We just wanted to clarify because, of course, when Rinpoche mentioned, he mentioned Tibet House. Yes, we had Tibet House here. We welcome everyone, but it's only us who was the organizer of this. Just wanted to clarify that for record. On that note, may I invite the chair of the next panel, who is also an associate professor in international relations at University of Birmingham, Dr. Tsering Topgyal. Tsering, over to you.
Okay, welcome back everyone, and thank you so much, Dibesh, for organizing this very important conference and for asking me to chair this very eminent panel. So this panel is on the historical perspectives on reincarnation in Tibetan Buddhism. Right? So some of us might think it's history, things that happened in the past, and boring and dry subject, right? But as we will know, in the course of this panel, it's not history that happened in the past, but history is an active force shaping contemporary politics, domestic politics, foreign policy. I know this because I teach Chinese foreign policy and East Asian international relations at my university, and the way that history that happened 10, 20, 100 years ago in the region are enabling or constraining policies between these countries and stopping the cooperation that would otherwise be expected from countries like Japan, China, or South Korea, and other countries in the region. So the question is, how is history relevant to China-Tibetan issues or understanding the current sort of struggle over the reincarnation issue of His Holiness and other important Tibetan Lamas? So a prominent China scholar called Harry Harding said that history is relevant to explaining contemporary developments in 5 different ways. First of all, it provides agenda items for discussion in meetings like this, or even in diplomatic intercourse in governments and countries. History provides a set of issues that either foster cooperation or prevent cooperation. History provides images of each other, mutual images. History provides a set of narratives with which we create meaning as well as construct our identities. And history provides positive and negative lessons for policy as well as for individual behavior. Right? And as a famous scholar from Johns Hopkins University who writes about the lost art of thinking historically, bad history or no history can lead to catastrophic policy choices. Right? So this panel is a very important panel. I know all 3 of these speakers for many years. They have been researching very deeply on these topics for many years, and they are also active in terms of the research. So we cannot get a better set of speakers on this particular topic. So I would like to invite in order Dr. Cameron Warner, who is at Aarhus University in Denmark. He will speak on who chose the Dalai Lama in the past, historical patterns and emergent trends, followed by Dr. Charles Manson, who is the Tibetan literature collection librarian at Bodleian Libraries in Oxford, as well as with the British Library. Charles will speak on origins and the continuity, genesis of the reincarnate Lama tradition of Tibet. And finally, we have Professor Martin Mills from Aberdeen University. He will talk about the Chenrezig lineage from Sontsen Gampo to the Dalai Lamas. So I would like to invite Professor Cameron first.
Thank you very much, Tsering, for the great introduction. And thank you to DBS and to Sonam Frazi for inviting us here. It's been absolutely fantastic so far this morning. And to follow up on some of your comments there, Tsering, as I begin, I like to begin my presentations with saying something about why me? Why am I the one giving this presentation? When His Holiness Dalai Lama announced in 2011 his plans to change the political system in Tibet, he also announced plans for his reincarnation and succession. And I tried to have conversations with this among Tibetans and Tibetan researchers, and I was told across the board this was a taboo. We're not supposed to talk about these things. And you did not see research happening through that period. But in the last few years, a few people started gathering, and we started talking about how it's really important to study this as it happens. As historians, sometimes we think we can wait 20 or 30 years after an event to look backwards in hindsight, but I'm also employed in anthropology at Aarhus University, and as anthropologists, we want to participate in an event as it happens and get a sense of what it's like for the people to live through the event as it's going on, how it impacts their lives. And so we started having a series of conferences. I got a grant from the Danish Research Council, the Danmarks Frie Forskningsfond, and we used the grant to have a research network with a series of conferences, first on the Dalai Lama's legacy, then on his leadership and devotion, then a conference on succession across the Himalayan world, not specifically on the Dalai Lama, in order to have a context for how these things happen. We're going to have a conference at Aarhus again to end the project in March on religion and succession across Asia, and then we'll give a report to the International Association Tibetan Studies Conference. And the network has spilled out in all different kinds of side events. So all three of these people have participated in some of these events. So has Lobsang Sangye, has been one of our key supporters and board members. Sonam Frazi has been a number of our events. Dibyesh was an event related to this. So it's a growing network of people who want to study and talk about these issues more. So if you are interested in coming to Aarhus in March, or if you're going to be in Kathmandu next August, please come by. We would look forward to talk to you some more. Excuse me. So I think one of the key questions we have is, what's the process for choosing a Dalai Lama? Who's been involved? And one of the first things I would like to say is it's an evolving process. It has not been done the same way all the time. And I can see, as an historian, there are four distinct periods. First, there's before the fifth Dalai Lama declared the Ganden Podang government. Then there's what happened during the 17th century under the Ganden Podang. Then there's a period in which the Qing Empire really dominated the succession processes for a number of different Tulku lineages across Tibet. And then there was an emerging independent movement in the 20th century. And I think that potentially we're entering into a fifth period in the future, although it's really sad to say, but Kala Rinpoche himself was talking about impermanence. Someday, unfortunately, His Holiness will pass away. And when he does so and a succession process has begun, it might be a new period because it'll be the first time that a Dalai Lama will be chosen who will not have direct political power. I think they'll have significant indirect political power, but not direct political power. And that'll change the calculus behind who's chosen and why, and who's involved in the selection process. So if we look very quickly at that first period, we see that succession is what I call an assemblage. It's a number of heterogeneous elements that come together. It's not one individual who decides who's the Dalai Lama. So the first four Dalai Lamas were chosen primarily by royalty, from families that lived nearby the royalty, or chosen from within a particular royal family.
Sorry to interrupt. Do you need the slides to...
Oh, did I forget to advance the slide? Oh,
change, yeah.
Thank you very much. Yeah, okay. So primarily chosen from a royal family or from families near a royal family happened for the first four Dalai Lamas. If we look at... too far ahead. There we go. If we look at the period of the 5th Dalai Lama, originally the ruler of central Tibet before the Ganden Podrong was Sangpa Desi, and the Sangpa Desi blocked the 4th Panchen Lama from searching and enthroning the 5th Dalai Lama. Most of the regents at the time after he was chosen were secular people, but under the Ganden Podrong, the secular regents dressed as monks. So an interesting sort of combination of religion and politics happening at the time. There was also a strong principle of what we call consanguine kinship among the 17th century regents. This means the regents under the Ganden Podrong, the people who served as the administrators for the 5th Dalai Lama, they were related to each other, and that was why they were chosen. And the last who was chosen in that family lineage was Sangye Gyatso as the 5th Dalai Lama's last regent. And the 5th Dalai Lama very publicly conferred on his regent his full proxy status. That meant Sangye Gyatso, as regent, had all the same powers and responsibilities as a Dalai Lama at the end of the 5th Dalai Lama's life. For the 6th Dalai Lama, he was chosen by Sangye Gyatso. Here's the only instance in which we can really say a single individual had say to themselves who got to be the Dalai Lama. And he was able to do that because he was appointed to have that role by the 5th. Now, as we know very briefly, some of you know Tibetan history, the 6th Dalai Lama was a very controversial figure. He was taken off the throne, and after he disappeared or died, an alternative 6th Dalai Lama was put on the throne. His regnal name was Yese Gyatso. Local Tibetans in Lhasa called him Pekar Dzimpa. He served as Dalai Lama for 13 years. It wasn't a brief moment in time. He was chosen by Lhasa Kang. He was enthroned by the 5th Dalai Lama, and he was supported by the Kangxi Emperor. This is an historical opportunity for us to look back in time and say, there is a possibility of making a mistake and having the mistake go on for a long time. But the system eventually corrects itself. And it did in the form of the 7th Dalai Lama. There were no search parties looking for a reincarnation of Sangye Gyatso. He was first identified by guardian spirits. Non-human beings found him. There were omens. A local monk in Kham became possessed by the deity Wooden Karpo. And so Lhasa Kang sent out his Tibetan military commander named Norbu Ngundrup, basically to kill this young boy. But Norbu Ngundrup met him and became convinced this was the reincarnation of Sangye Gyatso. And so then he ended up protecting the young boy along with the boy's father. But eventually his father interfered in Lhasa politics, and even after the 7th Dalai Lama was enthroned, he was for a time exiled back to Kham in order to get his father out of politics. And then only later was he eventually confirmed by the Gelugpa Hierarchs and the Kangxi Emperor. So it is possible that there are other ways in which a person is really the correct person for the throne who makes their way there through other forces besides the most important men of the time. That's another interesting historical example. Then we have the 8th Dalai Lama. Here, the Kangxi Emperor eliminated the offices of Khan and Desi, and he replaced this with the Kashak and the Ambans, who are the government of central Tibet into the early 20th century. And it's a different Lama, the Chankya Lama, Ropé Dorje, who convinced the Chenlong Emperor to let the 7th Dalai Lama have executive power. So the 7th Dalai Lama does rise up to that level. After he dies, the Kashak is the one, the cabinet, who appoints the 6th Demo Rinpoche as the regent, and they instruct him to find the 8th Dalai Lama. So the process there is, it begins with this cabinet, and they appointed a regent. It wasn't appointed by the 7th Dalai Lama, and then that regent has to begin the process. What did the regent do? He consulted the Panchen Lama, he consulted oracles. The Panchen Lama specifically chose the name and the tutors. And this is an interesting process with the Kashak because at the time there was a rotating position between in Beijing, you'd have a position in which somebody would serve the emperor as the imperial preceptor, or also a title that was called Lama of the Seal. And then after they would serve the emperor, they'd be sent to Tibet to serve in the Kashak or as the regent. So it's pretty clear at this time that the internal politics in Lhasa is being heavily interfered with by Beijing. And this is probably why we see that the next 4 Dalai Lamas do not live very long and do not really come into full executive power. So the 9th Dalai Lama was one of 2 candidates, but he was the one that rose up to be the Dalai Lama was the favorite choice of the 8th Dalai Lama's attendants. This is also an important way of understanding how someone becomes a Dalai Lama. Often, it's the previous Dalai Lama's closest servants and attendants who have the biggest influence on the process, because they're the ones who knew the previous Dalai Lama the best. And they can look at the candidates and say they're convinced of who the right boy is. So even though the attendants chose him, the final authority officially had to fall on the 7th Panchen Lama, and the Tibetans deliberately avoided using the golden urn. In the case of the 10th Dalai Lama, there were 6 candidates, and the one that was chosen was favored by the oracles, officials, and the regent at the time. They all came to a consensus. The Qing insisted upon the golden urn being used, but the locals in Lhasa had already come to their consensus candidate anyway. With the 8th Dalai Lama, he was actually identified by the 73rd Ganden Tripa. So here we have a completely different process all over again, which the Ganden Tripa is the one involved in choosing who it is. In this case, he was later confirmed by the golden urn, and he almost came to power before he was killed. In the case of the 12th Dalai Lama, there were 3 candidates, and one of them correctly chose the objects of the 11th Dalai Lama. So here's this other example we're quite familiar with from films like Kundun, that a child chooses the correct objects. That has not been the case of all the previous Dalai Lamas, but it was the case with the 12th Dalai Lama. And now we get to the 13th. The 12th Dalai Lama's face turned toward the southeast. So here we have the corpse itself intervening in this process. The 8th Panchen Lama, the Necheng Oracle, confirmed the direction where the search party should go, and later the Necheng Oracle gave precise details, including the names of the child's parents. So this is yet a different process. It's not completely different, but there are different authority figures that are more emphasized in the Namtar as to what were the most important signs. This means the Necheng can be an important sign, or not necessarily. It's different every time. After that, the regent, who was at the time the 2nd Kundaling, and the Kashak, they appointed a former abbot of Gyuto Monastery to head the search party. And he then went to Lama Lotso for visions. So again, now we see the role of this lake and the visions from the lake. It turns out there were no other candidates. All of these signs, in part because the Necheng Oracle had named the parents, all pointed to only this person who became the 13th Dalai Lama. Again, no golden urn was used. Why bother? Everybody knew he was the one, right? Lastly, we have the current Dalai Lama. Again, the 13th Dalai Lama wanted to be involved in this process. He turned his head toward the northeast after he passed away. A search party was sent out, led by Kutsang Rinpoche. There were 3 search parties. Why was Kutsang Rinpoche in charge of the search party that went to the northeast? He was one of the 13th Dalai Lama's closest personal attendants. The Redding Rinpoche went to Lama Lotso for visions. 2 minutes. Yes, thank you. And the 9th Panchen Lama reported to Kutsang Rinpoche that as he passed through Kumbha Monastery, he identified 3 boys in the region. One of those boys that he was particularly impressed with was Lama Dundrup, who was already at Kumbum at the time. Eventually, of course, as we all know from the hagiography and so forth, the 14th Dalai Lama as a young boy recognized the search party. He recognized the previous possessions of the 13th Dalai Lama. And again, all of the searchers came to a consensus decision. There was no need to do a golden urn, but there was also no need to do a mo, which is often done in tulku selection. No divination needed. We all knew it had to be this boy. So what we see, if we look at all these together, the succession between Dalai Lamas is a lengthy, complicated process that involves many different kinds of actors. You have the office of the Dalai Lama involved, the Ganden Podrang, a really special role played by his personal attendants. You have Tibetan politicians, you have the regent, the Panchen Lama, the Ganden Tripa, aristocratic families. You have foreign political influence, and really importantly, you have non-human actors who are also involved in the process. Altogether, we realize that the search for a Dalai Lama has continually evolved over time. It's not a tradition. It isn't a tradition. It does not have to be preserved by anybody, including Beijing, as an example of tradition. It's not. It's a set of optional customs. The order of the customs matters, so the order you follow them matters, but you don't have to do all of them with every single time. In all these examples, you see a number of these steps were skipped over because they were not needed or because something else really important happened. It's an incredibly flexible process that results eventually in the right person. So what's the process? No, this is my last statement. So there's instructions from the previous Dalai Lama, there's signs, visions, candidates, testing of them, but then you have to confirm them, you have to enthrone them, you have to have a tonsure ceremony, a name-giving ceremony, novice vows, an education, full monastic vows, and only in the case of the 13th and 14th Dalai Lamas, Geshe Lerumpa. And then you finally have a Dalai Lama. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Next, we have Charles.
Yes. Just
You're
escaping. So I can see that.
Hello, good afternoon. Can you put it on presenter format? No? Okay, that's fine, yeah, as it was before. Oh, like that. No? Yeah, okay, that's fine, thank you.
Yep, it's here.
We're okay.
It is your slides?
Yes.
Okay. Do you want to test out the clicker?
We're good to go. Thank you for your introduction as well. And thank you to the University of Westminster and Professor Annan for the, and Sonam Frazi. Thank you for the invitation. Can you hear me now? Yes. Forgive me. Do tell me if I go quiet. Okay, I work, as you can see, for the Tibetan collections at the Bodleian Library and the British Library. I ride two horses, and I've had some experience of retreats as well, as a practitioner too. And some of you will know of Professor Tuttle's analysis of the incarnations and how the new incarnations developed. So he was really looking at the rate of incarnations over the centuries. And you'll see where it begins over there. It's, and I would claim that it's largely acknowledged that it begins really in the 13th century. There are evidences of people calling themselves incarnation or being called incarnation, but continuous incarnation doesn't start until the 13th century. And this is with this figure, Karmapakshi, who's known as the second Karmapa. The first Karmapa, Dusum Khenpa, was not called Karmapa in his lifetime. He didn't claim to it, but it was retroactively assigned to him the name, the title, And the Karmapakshi refers to himself as Karmapa numerous times in his autobiography writings. So this, just very briefly, I'm going to skim through a little bit of history in case of some of us don't know it. We know about Tibet, the highlands of Asia, and these are some of the places that are associated with Karmapakshi, except for Shigatse. But he begins in the east, he goes to the center, he goes up here into China, up to Karakoram, across to Al-Malik, along the Silk Roads, back is imprisoned and tortured, and spends some time in exile up here and then back. But we'll just briefly look at his life. And if to go back a bit to the 7th century, well, the 9th century in this case, but the Tibetan Empire began in the, we can call it the 7th century, and then it dissipated after 842, after the assassination of the emperor. So we have this, what's known as the Ngada, the early development, and then the Chida, the later development of Buddhism in Tibet. And in between, leading up to the Chida, is what's known as the rekindling the embers. So Tibet was Buddhist, it subsided somewhat, and then it rekindled. So this gives, some of the dates there, and some of the features of it. I can't, in the time constraints, go into the details, but you can see them there. And historically, the context around Tibet is that in 1204, or round about 1204, the invasion of northern India. And this, in a way, you can think of as cutting off Buddhism, the original areas of Buddhism from Tibet. So Tibet starts to really develop its own type of Buddhism, you could say. I mean, it had got it from India. And we have, to the north, we have the death of Chinggis Khan during Karmapakshi's life. And after that, after some time, his grandsons attempt to conquer China. Eventually, they succeed in the Yuan dynasty. And we have also the Mongol invasion of Tibet in 1240, mostly in the central parts of Tibet, not in the east so much, where Karmapakshi was at the time in 1240. So he was born in 1204, just northwest of Derge, and he was a precocious child. He could read very early. He would read for the villagers and so forth. And he decided, or perhaps it was decided for him, we don't know, to go into central Tibet to further his studies. And he was on his way, and somewhere south of Chamdo, he met with, there's his birthplace, and he met with Pomdrakpa, an older teacher. This would have been when he was 11 years old, so Pomdrakpa was about 45 or so, middle-aged man. And after Pomdrakpa invited him to stay for a bit, and after an initiation, he called him aside and said, I had lots of... Is this going? Somebody?
Someone fix the mic? Someone?
Okay. Is this working?
Yes.
He called him aside and said, I had lots of visions of this Saint Dusum Khyentse at the time, all around you, and you must have a very strong karma connection. So Dusum Khyentse had been a disciple of Gampo, who then goes back to a disciple of Milarepa, and Marpa, the translator, who goes back to Naropa as well. So we have this lineage. And Pomdrakpa, as far as I know, or we can ascertain, did not meet Dusum Khyentse. He was the student of the student of Dusum Khyentse. So it's a little bit remote, really. But he had numerous visions of Dusum Khenpa, and particularly in relation to Karma Pakshi. So Dusum Khenpa himself had Dusum Khenpa, knower of the three times, the past, the present, the future. He was quite adept at recounting previous lifetimes and even concurrent lifetimes as well, emanations. And of course, towards the end of his life, students become interested in where are you going to reincarnate next. And he, in 4 separate accounts given by close disciples, he more or less gives the same account of these 3 types of rebirth he's going to have. In the west of India, in the south of central Tibet, and in particular in relation to Karma Pakshi, this is important, we'll see later, another 50, 60 years later, for the sake of one disciple and will benefit many. Which seems a bit peculiar because the emanations are all bodhisattvas by definition, really, and the sort of ethos of a bodhisattva is to take rebirth for the sake of all beings. So why would it be for the sake of one being? It seemed a bit of a puzzle. And also in South India. So we just park that for the moment because it becomes relevant later. So Dusum Khenpa's student was Drogon Rechen, and then Pomdrakpa after him. And we can say that this was the first stage of the reincarnation development process during Karma Pakshi's life. That there was a recognition of the karma connection to the predecessor, although the predecessor had died 11 years before, so before he was born. So it is a bit of a gap at this stage. These are some of the teachings that Karma Pakshi received from Pomdrakpa, the Doha of Sara, the Mahamudra of Gampopa, and a particular teaching, Introduction to the 3 Kayas, which is body, breath, and mind, sort of coordination teaching, which I occasionally teach myself to help to revive it. And later he was sent to Katok Monastery, a Nyingma monastery, so he's in the Kagyu tradition. He goes to Nyingma Monastery for his ordination from Jampa Bum and sort of intellectual training, shall we say, rather than the practice training that he'd had from Pomdrakpa. And after some time, probably in his mid-20s or so, he goes back to Pomdrakpa, and they proceed to go down to Markham here, because these are the great 8 rivers of Asia, and unfortunately, at Markham, Pomdrakpa dies, and Karma Pakshi is somewhat, well, he writes himself, well, it's written perhaps at his dictation, that he was somewhat sad, and we could almost say depressed, but anyway, he didn't know what to do, in a sense. He was so distraught about losing his guru, and he had a vision and said to go east. Well, he went up to near Batang, northeast, and he spent the next, 11 and then 13 years in retreat on this mountainside, eventually building this building. These are the ruins. And at time...
5 minutes.
Yeah, thank you. At the time, he became very adept at meditation and gained a reputation. So then he came out of retreat and he started taking up the mantle of Dusum Khenpa's monasteries, repairing them. This is when they were all founded, something like 100 years before, and repairing them. And then he was invited to go into central Tibet, to Tsurpu, where Dusum Khenpa had founded a small monastery there. It later became larger. This is from the 20th century. And he spent some years there, 5 or 6 years. And Kublai Khan, meanwhile, was marauding down the east side of Tibet. He went down to Dali. And as he went, he heard about this great meditator. So he issued an invitation to him to come to his court, an invitation that probably was more like a command. And Kamapaksi went, and this is a bit of a joke. This is an early AI generated. It was just one instruction, so you could develop it, and it was when AI was quite early, a couple of years ago, just for amusement. And initially he got on well with Kublai Khan, and then they fell out. So he went north to Karakoram, met Mongi Khan, and they got on very well. Now, as he approached Mongi Khan, he had this intuition or realization that maybe this is the resolution of that being reborn for the sake of one person. Because as he approached the great Mongol emperor, palace, he understood that Mongi Khan was probably the one person, because if he converted him to Buddhism, or helped him anyway, then it would help a huge range of people, from Korea right across to Hungary, Poland. He was the emperor of this whole area at that time. It was at the apogee of the Mongolian Empire. And I've lost the connection.
You get exclamated for that.
Thank you. Mm-hmm. Yes. Yes, good. So he meets Mongi Khan. He develops, I won't go through all these, policies with Mongi Khan. Mongi Khan accepts him as a teacher, a Buddhist teacher, and he gives him instruction in Mahamudra, and they part amicably. He had parted from Kublai Khan not very amicably. So Mongi Khan goes south to attack China. They wanted to overtake China, and Kamapaksi leaves, goes across to Al-Malik, but seems to have very little success there with the Islamic court, or they had a preference for Islam. And then he leaves down here, and he meets Mongi Khan again here, and Mongi goes further into China, and he dies of disease. And Kamapaksi remains here, and so then we have, in 1260, a Mongolian succession war. And Kublai Khan issued a death warrant against Kamapaksi because he had been favored in the Mongolian court in Karakoram. And he thought of him as being the enemy, the friend of Arik Burke, the youngest brother, and who was where the fighting was happened between Arik Burke and Kublai Khan. Anyway, the war was resolved by, I suppose, you can call it a war. In 1264, and Kamapaksi was sent into internal exile. He was captured, tortured, but he seemed to escape all these tortures very miraculously. And he was sent for a few years, to this remote area in northeast China. The dispute ends, and Kublai Khan calls him back to his court near where Beijing eventually developed. Beijing hadn't been founded yet properly as a city, where Kublai Khan built up a lot of it. And they had some degree of reconciliation. And Kublai Khan asked him to be his teacher, and he said, "I think I've had enough. I'm going back home." So he proceeds.
In 1 minute.
Yeah, I'll try. Okay. Okay. He proceeds back to Tserpo. We need to do the third element of it. He proceeds back to Tserpo, and there there's some pilgrims, and he takes aside one of the pilgrims and says, "I need to borrow your house." And he's it seems that it's not explicitly said that he's setting up the birth of the next Karmapa, or the birth of his next reincarnation. Because a couple of years later, a child is born to that couple, and 5 years later, he gets recognized as the third Karmapa, that child. And also with the lineage continuity, Urgent Rinchen Pel, another Mahasiddha, is visiting in around about 1280, and he gives him instruction, initiation, and what is called the wordless transmission. So, and then Urgenpa, 5 years later, after Karmapakshi has died, then instructs the third Karmapa, Rangjung Dorji. And as you can see, I've written a book about it, or you can see in more detail various YouTube talks about it, giving different angles, sometimes more on the manuscripts, sometimes more on the practices. But just as a summation, some of the factors in Karmapakshi's influence of this tradition developing is that this is the first time that a child is identified as a rebirth. Before, it was adults and, oh, you're a rebirth of so-and-so, or I'm a rebirth of so-and-so. This is the first time that a child is identified, that his charisma was very important, and often with the beginnings of incarnations, it's the charisma of the originator that is so important, and then it gets into an institution, really. And the resolution of the prediction, and that's a kind of authentication. And then there's also this pattern of sponsorship from outside sources, in this case, China and Mongolia. Of course, nowadays, it's the West generally, as well as, of course, China too. And how he was quite careful to prepare for the future transference of the lineage. He made sure that there was a teacher to teach the next incarnation, the next child. And then lastly, he gave some indication of where the next child would be born, both by indicating the father and mother, and also in the direction of where he would be born. So I think I'll have to stop there.
Thank you. Next we have Martin. I would like to give more time, but I'm under strict orders from DBS to finish on time, which is why I have to stick to the time limits.
Okay, I get to start now, and I will endeavour to be as quick as possible so that...
Whenever you're ready.
Sure. There is a certain history to this paper. In November, Lobsang Sangye kindly invited me to Harvard to speak on the first to the 14th Dalai Lamas. Sonam Frazi has kindly invited me to speak on the question of those that went before, all the way and possibly back to Sontsen Gampo and before. There's a long history to this. Sonam Frazi has been patiently waiting for a book on Sontsen Gampo out of me for nearly 20 years. And I think this is his way of getting each chapter out bit by bit from me, like pulling teeth. But it gives me the opportunity to speak on this question that is important to thinking about how the Dalai Lamas and the Dalai Lama reincarnation lineage was understood. And in particular, I want to sort of push past a point that I made in Harvard, which was that the Dalai Lama lineage is a lineage of person, not of office. Now, I want to expand that a little bit by reference in particular to an apocryphal tale regarding the 10th Panchen Lama. A few weeks before he died in 1989, during a public gathering, he was asked whether or not he thought he was really the reincarnation of the 9th. And his answer, apparently apocryphally to this, was, I don't know if it really matters, because who you are is what you do. Okay? which of course is an important pointer towards the concept of karma, of work, that leads from one lifetime to the next, and of the next incarnation fulfilling the work and aspirations of the previous one in some way, shape, or form. And I'd just like you to keep that on board because it's important to what comes up next. If one is to read the biography of the first Dalai Lama, written by Geshe Tsomo, The Rosary of Jewels, the lifetimes before the first Dalai Lama were also reincarnations, and obviously this makes sense. The name the Dalai Lama was first given to Sonam Gyatso, what is now the third Dalai Lama, and the term Dalai Lama was applied retrospectively to the Gendun Gyatso and to Gedundrup before them, who were recognized as a lineage of reincarnations. But of course, in the Buddhist perception of the world, that person cannot have started with Gedundrup. There has to have been a cause before that. And that cause was a lifetime that preceded it, and a lifetime that preceded that, and a lifetime that preceded that, and a lifetime that preceded that, and a lifetime that preceded that. Like all of us here from a Buddhist perspective, we go back forever. It is quite literally turtles all the way down, for those who get that literary reference. Now, in the biography of the first Dalai Lama by Geshe Tsomo, three primary pre-incarnations are recognized. The first, most obviously, is Chenrezig himself, Avalokiteshvara, the Lord who looks kindly down upon the world, who took Tibet as his special field of merit, as the place that he was asked by the Buddha Shakyamuni to convert, even though at that time there were no humans there at all. A place of darkness and of hell beings and all of those things, and to gradually bring them, that plateau bit by bit to a place of enlightenment and a place of the Buddha's doctrine. So here we have the four-armed version. I'm hoping this works. There we go. Here we have the four-armed version of Avalokiteshvara, who himself appears in myriad forms. All the way up to the 1,000-armed, 11-headed form that one, for example, could have found long ago in the Jokang Temple in the North Chapel. And that statue, of course, was famously built in a dream by Sontsen Gampo, the first Buddhist emperor of Tibet, who built the Jokang Temple, or the Lhasa Tsuglakang, if you want to call it that, or the Rasa Trunang, whichever name you wish to use, who built it at Lhasa, who really founded Lhasa as a temple enclosure to begin with on the Kishu Valley, and which later became the city of Lhasa. So Sontsen Gampo himself, that first great emperor who founded the Tibetan written language, who is meant to have written the laws, although there's great debate about that, there's great debate about much of Sontsen Gampo's life, who is meant to have first brought the Tibetans under the great fold of the Buddha Dharma, who built the first three great temples of Lhasa, Trandruk, and Ramoche, who did all of these kinds of things. He is seen to be the Dalai Lama's sort of earliest human manifestation in the first biography. This is then followed by Druntrun Gyalwa, the founder of Reting Monastery, who is also Atisha Dipankara's disciple, and really brings into being the Kadam school of Buddhism, the great source of those wonderful teachings, the Lojong teachings, for example, Geshe Chikawa and Langri Tangpa. And this is then leads on to Gedundrup, okay? So we have a sort of rudimentary story of those earlier incarnations. Now, I'm going to pop that up there to give a sense of this, because this lineage transforms. This is one of the great ones that I find, particularly secular historians come to me and they go, this is all made up. And they point towards the following problem, which for them is a problem. This is the lineage of pre-incarnations as identified in the biography of the first Dalai Lama. This is the lineage of the biography of the third Dalai Lama, written quite early on in the Ganden Potong's status as government in 1646, The Chariots of the Ocean of Attainment. And here we can see the addition of quite a few extra figures. So we have some figures from the imperial period, Nyatri Tsempo, La Tototri, for example, those earlier emperors. Nyatri Tsempo, the first one who's meant to have come over the mountain at Yarla Shampo and founded the Yarlung dynasty. Tlatotori, for example, who is meant to have received the first Buddhist scripts in Tibet, which fell from the sky upon the roof of Yumbu Lakong. And he set them up even though he couldn't read them, and his lifetime was meant to have been extended by them. But then, after Sontsen Gampo, we also have Trisong Detsen. Often not regarded as a manifestation of Chenrezig, but it is here. But he is here. Trisong Detsen, who with Padmasambhava founded Samye. Then we have Drontong Gyalwa. Then we have Kaji Gonpa, Sachen Kunga, Lama Zhang, Nima Odser, Hlaje Gewa Bum, and then Gedundrup. All right. If we then move one step further, I'm going to go quite a lot further here, and we go to the later stages of the fifth Dalai Lama's biography, we have this many incarnations. Okay, a huge range of extra ones that appear quite early in the foundation of the world. So we have Jigten Wangchuk, for example, who is really kind of a sort of semi-human, semi-divine figure, Lokeshvara, who is Lord of the world. But we also have an enormous introduction of an Indian tradition that largely comes out of the Book of Kadam, the Kadam Lekbam. We also have the introduction of a wide variety of political figures. We have some, for example, as you can see, that actually interject within the lineage of the Dalai Lamas as named. So here we have, for example, Gedundrup, and after that we have Rinchen Khenrab Choje. Then after the second Dalai Lama, we have Ngari Panchen and Chogyal Wonpode from the Nyingma tradition. Okay, so at this late point in the life of the fifth Dalai Lama, actually really close to his death, by that point, particularly his regent Sangye Gyatso has produced a really elaborate lineage. And as I say, to a large extent, a lot of sort of secular historians who have no particular interest in how the Buddhist teachings inflect upon this, they look at it simply as a political lineage. They tend to sit there and kind of go, well, they're obviously just making it up. Or they're putting in place important figures. But I'd like to point out several features of this list which point to there being also a religious dimension and a set of religious Buddhist understandings that inflect and create this list to a certain extent. In doing so, I'm going to make two general points. The first is that when you read these texts, they don't necessarily read as a list that says, these are the people that were previously the Dalai Lama. In many cases, they start with, these are the embodiments of Chenrezig's actions in Tibet. Okay, so the claim is, particularly for the earlier ones, is a subtler claim. It's a claim about the activities of Chenrezig. It also, to a certain extent, becomes a discussion of the pre-incarnations of the present, at that point, fifth Dalai Lama. So those two narratives actually mix together. They can join like threads. Okay, so there's a little bit of a balance that needs to be dealt with there. But the other is to ask who's on that list, who is actually on there. And here in particular, I'm not going to go through them one by one because I've only got 5 minutes left. Instead, I'm going to sort of say, well, generally speaking, we can point towards a variety of different groups and figures. The first, which are worth pointing out, as has been pointed out earlier, is that all of the major pre-Gelug schools are represented on that list. Nyingma, Kadam, Sakya, Kagyu. Not all of the precise sub-schools, but generally speaking, you can find figures from all of those schools there. The second is, we have quite a lot of rulers of Tibet, okay? Particularly from the imperial lineage, particularly from that period running up to and just after Sontsen Gampo. The third is an important set of Nyingma treasure revealers, okay? Particularly from what's called the Northern or Jangte tradition, okay? Figures such as Wampo Day, for example, and so forth. The fourth is a whole set of revealers of the ritual and mythic cycles of Chenrezig. Those terton, those treasure revealers that revealed, for example, the Manikambum or the Kachem Kakolma, or all of these texts, the Pillar Testament, all of those texts that speak strongly to the revelation of truths about Chenrezig's activity in Tibet are in that list. The next one, interestingly, is a history of flood defenders of Lhasa. Lhasa, in case you didn't know it, is on a floodplain and regularly gets flooded and has done throughout most of, as far as we can tell, post-imperial history. There is some suggestion by archaeologists that during the imperial period, here's a story for the ages, during the imperial period, the Lhasa floodplain was deforested to build things like temples and stuff like that. And it may have made way for actually a rather flood and drought cycle on the Lhasa plain. I can't speak to that. I'm not an archaeologist, or for that matter, a dendrologist. And the flooding of Lhasa was often regarded as a quality of the end of Dharma. That the flooding of the Jokang temple in particular was the endeavor by the water spirits, and most particularly a gentleman by the name of Maldor Zichen, who is the king of the water spirits from the northern Kishu valleys, to take back the Jowo statue into the realm of the water spirits, okay, and therefore end Dharma in the human world, okay. So in this sense, many figures like Klaje Gawabum, for example, were key figures in protecting and building dikes in Lhasa, sometimes through magical means, through, for example, bringing, by the capacity to magically levitate rocks, huge boulders from the Yalang Valley, all the way to Lhasa to build the dikes, which was one of the Klaje Gawabum's magical capacities. And finally, in all of these, a subtle point, which is, by and large, while key religious figures are often identified, they are very rarely preceptors. They are the disciples of preceptors. Okay? It doesn't tend to be Atisha Dipankara, it's Drumton. It's not Sakya Pandita, it's Pakspa. Okay? So there's always a little bit in which it's the follower. Okay? Now, in all of this, and I better finish up because I've got 10 seconds. I have to be clear that there is a pattern to the way in which the different biographies identify pre-existent reincarnations. And that pattern seems to come from identifying the person whose biography you're talking about, looking at the main features of their lives and saying, how are those actions echoed in the past? So, for example, Sonam Gyatso, the third Dalai Lama, not only did he, well, one, he went to Mongolia and he created a great alliance with Altan Khan, and in the biography it says, we are Pakpa and Kublai Khan, reincarnated. So Pakpa ends up in the list because it is the same kind of action reincarnated as an echo in the body of the third Dalai Lama. The third Dalai Lama was also a flood defender. He was actually one of the major producers of great rituals to defend Lhasa from the floods. We get an introduction of the imperial histories when the fifth Dalai Lama becomes effectively an imperial ruler of Tibet. So in a sense, it isn't, if we talk about Chenrezig's action going forward, we can also talk about an echo of work previously done in past lives. And at that point, I will leave it.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Martin. I think we had three very excellent historical accounts on one of the most important deities of Tibetan Buddhism, Chenrezig, and the two of the most important reincarnation lineages, the Dalai Lamas and the Karmapas. So in about 2 minutes' time, I will ask for questions from the floor. But while I give you time to think, process what you just heard and think about your questions, I will start off with 2 very quick questions. The first question has to do with this disconnect between, what Buddhist philosophy preaches and, what you, all 3 of you mentioned in terms of the reincarnation lineages, right? On the one hand, all 3 of you touched on various aspects of efforts by various Tibetan sects or the broader Tibetan community to preserve and endeavor for continuity of lineages or teachings or linking sacred history to political authority, right? But on the other hand, in Buddhist philosophy, all 3 of you will be very aware of the insistence on the metaphysical belief in or principle of impermanence, right? So it is a slight disconnect. So what I would like all 3 of you to tell us, as concisely as possible, is in the historical records or the Buddhist texts or whatever it is, how do they reconcile these 2 things? Insistence on impermanence and change, and the need to preserve and making efforts to in terms of continuity of lineages, teachings, and things like that. The second question is to carry on with my remarks at the beginning. You gave very rich historical accounts, but one thing I have to clarify to my students, for example, when we talk about how history is shaping contemporary politics in East Asia, China, and all of that, is separate the historical events accounts from history as an active factor or force shaping contemporary politics, right? So what I would like to ask each of 3 of you is to talk a bit about what lessons Tibetans and the broader Tibetan Buddhist world can learn from this history in the struggle against China for the next Dalai Lama and other important reincarnations. Because at the end of the day, in China's colonial exploitation of Tibetan people, resources, the Tibetan institutions, including the reincarnation institution, is one of those institutions that are being exploited by China for their own imperial colonial interests, right? So what lessons should Tibetans take from this history to confront China in this emerging David versus Goliath struggle? Starting from Martin.
Okay, I'm going to give that last question a go, because you actually asked 3 questions there, but I'm going to go with the last one. One of the aspects of the story I've just told, for example, is the gradual shift, in particular within the Gelug school, of coming to terms with the question of the reincarnate lineage at all. Tsongkhapa famously was not a fan of the idea. He said, well, other people do that, but we're not going to do that. But then with the Dalai Lamas in particular, you get this introduction of the idea. It's not something that's initially popular at Tasha Lumpo, with Gedundrups, with the monastic authorities there. There's something of a battleground over Gedun Gyatso, the second Dalai Lama's life, which actually leads him to prolifically produce temples all around Tibet as a consequence, because he's wandering around because he can't go to Tasha Lumpo. But that's really trying to kind of work that out. One of the key aspects of the distinction between, particularly in the wake of the 5th Dalai Lama, and other schools on the question of reincarnation, is how tight it is, how regulated it is. Okay? And what you see, particularly in the wake of the fifth Dalai Lama, is a very careful tendency to create a rational lineage, a changa a rosary of lives, rather than, for example, a rosary of activities. So in other cases, for example, you have people whose reincarnations can actually be several of them simultaneously. There can be reincarnations of body, of speech, of activities, of all of these kinds of things. So there is a kind of balance between what the state seems to require, which is political clarity, and the political clarity of a lineage. And here I'm simply speculating, by the way. And what a religious tradition requires, which is a lot more fluid. Now, what I find is interesting under these circumstances is that the present Dalai Lama has turned around and said, perhaps the answer is fluid. It's still my choice, but there isn't, in a sense, that demand anymore, and it's much more seriously under his control. But he has put out in his proclamations, well, there are several possibilities here, and it doesn't necessarily fit with the Ganden Potong when it was in charge of state power.
Charles?
Yes, well, with the continuity and impermanence, I think in the particular time that I'm interested in, it's the very early days of this idea of continuity of starting in terms of rebirth. But the continuity of lineage was extremely important, always has been for Buddhists, oral continuity, and then with the literature and initiations in order to and instructions given in order to maintain a direct link, hopefully, to the Buddha originally. But in the 13th century, the late 12th, you have these charismatic teachers, in particular Kamapakshi, who then sort of through the charisma, in a way, invites the idea that maybe we can get, this isn't said, I'm interpreting here, maybe we can get some kind of, not exactly physical continuity, that's impossible, but some, in terms of, everybody dies, but some lineage into a child who can then continue. In a way, it's a bit of a risk, because if you think of continuity, you've always got an interregnum, so to speak. You've got between the time that somebody dies and the time that somebody can then continue their karma, their activity, and usually about 16 years. So that introduces a risk, and especially when it becomes Dalai Lamas and you've got the politics of the whole country involved, that introduces some degree of risk. Whereas if you've got an uncle-nephew lineage or a family lineage, it's automatic. We all saw how within a couple of days of the late Queen dying, the king went to the 4 countries and asserted his authority, basically. That's what was going on. So they didn't have to wait another 16 years for a child to grow up. It's a different system. So there are risks in having that, but in a sense it's more, it's not a blood continuity, it's a realization continuity, hopefully. That's what the idea is. And so that you get both the instructions, as long as they're passed on from one disciple, the person dies, and then that disciple then teaches the next person. You get an instructions continuity as well. But the core of it is the realization of the previous person. Well, in this case, it was a charismatic Mahasiddha.
Kim?
I think that Tibetan thought is incredibly subtle in a really impressive way. And so your question refers to that, the idea of is basically continuity and impermanence a contradiction? And I think continuity is about trying to maintain the Buddha's presence. So is presence and impermanence a contradiction? And I don't think that they are, actually. If you begin with impermanence, The Buddha first teaches impermanence as this way of understanding suffering, right? So
By the way, you published a book with impermanence as the title.
Yes,
So
yes. I did. The Buddha first teaches impermanence as like the origin of some of our suffering because of our attachment. We don't want things to change. But actually, liberation is impossible without change. So it's the beginning of suffering, but it's also the way out of suffering too. And Tibetans did something really fascinating with this in terms of material culture and ritual practice. So if you go to Lhasa and you go to the Jokang, the Rasa Chulan Tsulakang, and the most important image is the Jo Rinpoche. Why is the Jo Rinpoche the most important image of the Buddha in Tibet? Because it's said to be made during the Buddha's lifetime to look the most like he looked. That's the basis of its authority, its power. And the Buddha blessed the image and gave the image his power, but again, because he said, this is the one that looks just like me. Okay, great. We have the presence of the Buddha in Tibet because it looks just like the Buddha. What do Tibetans do when they go to venerate it? You paint it with gold. And you paint with gold so much, the gold builds up, and it changes. You can see in the photographs, it does not look the way it used to look. So we just handed something that looks just like the Buddha, and what's the first thing you do? You change it. So it doesn't look like the Buddha anymore. And that is not a problem. It's never been a problem, because that's the way that the veneration is expressed. So you see in this one image, this one ritual that's so important for Lhasa, the presence of the Buddha and the impermanence of it in one image. And it works quite well, I think.
Okay. Any takers on my second question about lessons for Tibetans going forward?
Can you say the full question again a little bit more beyond the lessons?
Yeah, essentially, China is exploiting the reincarnation institution and how Tibetans can learn lessons.
Yeah. Okay, so the Communist Party of China in the 50s, 60s, and 70s tried to destroy as much of Tibetan culture as possible. We all know that, right? In the 80s, as China tries to emerge as a world nation, it starts adopting the language of the world, including the language of the West. It starts saying it's going to be the one to preserve culture. It's going to preserve heritage, material heritage, and intangible heritage. It goes to places like the Jokang, and it puts all of the statues behind glass cases, making it into basically a museum. And so some of the language that the Communist Party uses now in relation to a 15th Dalai Lama is the Communist Party says the Dalai Lama in India cannot change the tradition. That is a violation of Tibetan heritage. We, the Communist Party, are going to preserve Tibetan heritage. That's why the Panchen Lama has to be involved, and that's why the golden urn has to be done, and that's why blah, blah, blah. So they've taken that language that the West had used, the West invented, and it's using it against it. The problem with that argument that's really easy for the Tibetan community to just smash, as you saw from my presentation, the Panchen Lama was not involved in all of the selections of the Dalai Lamas. And when he was involved, he wasn't always the most important voice in that process. The golden urn wasn't used all the time. Even when it existed, it wasn't used all the time. There isn't any particular way that the PRC can say it has to be done in this way or it's invalid. It's not a violation of heritage or tradition. It's something that the Tibetan community possesses to do with as you need to do in the way that works for you this time. And it might be different than in the past, but in the past, it was almost different every single time anyway. So don't worry about, is it being done exactly like the past? Pay attention to, is it done in the way that we need to do it now? That's my message.
Thank you. Okay, any questions from the audience? We'll take 3 questions at a time. Is there a mic going around? Or can I have a mic here? Can you raise your hand if you have a question, so I know? Okay, there are 3. First here. Can you please identify yourself? Make the questions as short as possible and no commentary.
Okay, I'm going to respect that. Kate Saunders. And I have a question for the panel about what is your reading of His Holiness's statement in July about the continuation of the institution in the context of this history of the lineages that you've so vividly explained. And I was going to ask another question about the implications of the Karmapa issue, but I think I'll leave that as we have no time.
If we have time, we'll come back. Okay. There was a question here. Did you have a question?
You hurrying us makes me more nervous now. So first of all, I want to say Toshilek to everyone, and please allow me some minutes. I'm very honored and lucky to be in the presence of all the learned people here, and I wish may all this virtue, good collective virtue, may be used for world peace and love. Thank you. My question is, so as the presenter has said, the reincarnation is like a support of not just some people, but so many powerful non-human entities defending that, right, future. So how will the China be able to challenge that? And I don't trust China, so even if you said that the Panchen Lama doesn't have to be involved in the reincarnation, right? Even though we know the history, we know the truth, we have all the proof, but China don't care. And what if they bring the new Dalai Lama, and how will the world respond? How can we challenge, and how can we stand? Okay, thank you.
Thank you. There was a question back there. We don't have a lot of time, so please make the questions as short as possible.
Yeah, experts. Yeah.
We can hear you.
Yeah. What kind of questions I should ask? You know, in 1977, I was around here, like such panel. Most of them are non-Tibetan, speaking about Tibetan politics. And I was standing there asking questions. Now, 2025, I'm still standing here asking questions. And so it's endless question. At that time, it was politics, but this time it's spiritual or a little bit religious. And I want to know, you have got a lot of experience, studied. So what is your definition of Chenrezig? No, I know Chenrezig in figures, you know, and also in Tanga paintings, what Chenrezig looks like. Now, I want to know from your point of view, I have a long time study of Tibetan culture and essence of Tibetan civilization. I want to know from your point of view the definition of Chenrezig. What is Chenrezig in body, speech, and mind?
Thank you, thank you.
That's the question.
Any of you?
Okay. There's, as you know, a story about Chenrezig that when he first made his vow to Amitabha, he said, if ever I give up my wish to save all beings, may my body and head break into 1,000 pieces. And this was when he only had 1 or 2 arms, preferably 2. And Amitabha said, "You sure about that?" And he said, "Yes." And he said, "Fine, I'll hold you to it." And an incalculable aeon went past, and human beings and sentient beings, he worked really hard to bring them forward. And at the end of it, a third of them were heading towards enlightenment, and a third of them were heading away from enlightenment, and a third of them weren't doing anything in particular, and were probably students. And so he struggled for another incalculable aeon, and at the end he looked, and a third were heading towards enlightenment, a third were heading away from enlightenment, and the third were doing nothing at all. And he went, sorry again. So for his third incalculable aeon as a bodhisattva, he struggled again. And at the end, he looked and a third were heading towards enlightenment, a third were heading away, and a third were doing it. And he went, oh, for crying out loud. All right, I give up. I'm just going to attain enlightenment for myself. Whereupon his vow came to fruition, and he broke into 1,000 pieces, and his head and his body shattered everywhere. And Amitabha appeared and went, I knew that would happen. And put his body back together with 1,000 arms, each with an eye in it, so that he can see the sufferings of all beings. And each of those hands was a king. And his body was his head with 11 heads, including, and Amitabha puts it at the top and says, after 3 incalculable aeons, and that last piece of understanding, you are now a Buddha, and prostrates to him as a full Buddha. To me, that is Chenrezig.
Okay, the other 2 questions, Charles and Cameron. The first 2 questions.
Kate,
Yes.
there's a lot to read into the Dalai Lama's statement, I think. But the part that I really want to think about myself, and I think we should think about more, is the way he names a number of different communities, which communities he names, that he says appeal to him to come back. And I think that creates for us an image of a kind of a global mandala of all of his support as not just being the Tibetan exiles in India, but much more broad than that. And I think it calls upon some of his values, including democracy. This sense of he's coming back because there's a deep desire for so many people for this institution to continue. It's not the same thing as it being imposed upon people. And it's not the same as, we've all heard stories of a particular tulku who says, don't look for my reincarnation, and then the community does afterwards. It's much more about a dialogue that happened, and he's giving evidence to that, and he's recognizing that. I think that's really fascinating. That's one aspect I'd focus on. And respond to the other question about, what China has to say and so forth. I would say, first of all, don't compromise on your own values. And so if you are a Buddhist of faith who believes that the world is comprised of more than just human beings, and other beings are involved in processes that we experience, then there's no reason for you to feel at all shy about saying, hey, this is, who the leader of our community is for many reasons, one of which is, and then point to whatever that non-human entity is that was involved in the process, whether it be a miracle that happened on the day they were born, or whether it be an oracle that pronounced something, or whatever that particular thing is. The last thing I would say with that is one of the reasons why it's so great for this to no longer be a taboo, right, is, one of the things we talked about for a couple of years is we all knew China was organizing, they were planning, they were giving speeches, they were out in the public. There's no taboo for them. So the supporters of the Dalai Lama also have to start talking a lot with each other, with friends, with non-Buddhists, with the media, and be organized behind an event that we all hope is not going to happen for a long time, but we all know is definitely going to happen. And in my personal and professional opinion, will be the biggest event in relation to Tibet of our careers. So we can't wait until afterwards to do something about it. We got to do something about it now. So thank you for your question.
Thank you. Charles, do you have any responses in about 30 seconds?
No, I think we've had good response. Go on.
Do you want to see?
You sure?
Sure.
Okay.
Yeah.
I'm going to say what I said at Harvard. But
30 seconds.
a teacher comes and teaches during their life. They give gifts to their students. In the next life, those gifts are handed back to the next incarnation in teachings that are required. I guess the question isn't, all these technical questions about the next reincarnation. The question is, for all of us. And I'm a Buddhist, His Holiness is my Dalai Lama. What do I give back? What will I have as an offering when he returns? That's the question each of us faces. As Buddhists, it's that question. The rest is up to him.
Okay, thank you very much. DBH is telling me to stop, so let's give a round of applause to the speakers.
Thank you so much to the panelists and Tsering for amazing chair. We have got 15 minutes for tea, coffee. Again, there'll be fresh tea and coffee downstairs. You know where it is, and then come back. And then we'll have a final session with 3 of the amazing speakers. Okay, 2 amazing speakers and third is me, so I can't call myself amazing. So see you in 15 minutes. Thank you.